Hello, good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be here. I came from far. It was 30 hours traveling. It was very good. I could take rest, and now I'm extremely happy to be here to share with you some experiences of environmental education in my country, Brazil, and also to share with you some experiences that I could have when I worked developing an environmental education program in the state of Rio de Janeiro. So let me introduce myself. My name is Inny Accioly. I am from Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. I am a professor in the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. So I will share some experiences of environmental education policies at the federal and the state levels, and talk about the trajectories of participatory democracy construction. So Brazil is that in the red. We are in South America, in the other side of the world. I speak Portuguese. I really wish I could speak your language so we could have a more direct conversation, but I will do my best in English. And last year, in 2018, approximately 1 million people were involved in rural conflicts for water, land, and human rights. It means that there are almost 1 million people that still have to fight for access to water, land, human rights. So it's a very big question, very big issue for environmental education. And in Brazil, we are in the top of the ranking of being the most dangerous country for being an environmental activist. The number of murdered environmental activists is the highest in the world. Environmental activists and human rights defenders are being murdered every year, every single day in the whole country. And now in my country, we have a very conservative government that is actually promoting discourses of hate and anger against human rights defenders. And I can say that it's an anti-environmentalist government. So it's a big challenge for us in Brazil. Well, it's a question, why relate environmental education to democracy and human rights? Is it possible to talk about sustainable development without considering human rights and social justice, specifically in this context where people are being murdered but for fighting for human rights, fighting for land, for water, for a health environment? So in Brazil, the history of institutionalization of environmental education policies is extremely linked to the trajectories of constructing democracy. So, but constructing democracy is not a very easy thing. It's still a challenge in Brazil. Our historical background, we were a colony from Portugal until 1822, in a kind of colony of exploitation of land and natural resources. In this time, our native people were murdered. And Brazil was the country in the Americas that received the largest number of African slaves. And it seems that Brazil was the last country in the world to formally abolish slavery. I say formally abolish because kinds of slavery still exists in the country. For example, between 1995 and 2015, the number of people found in situations similar to slavery was almost 50,000 people. So, and Brazil became a republic in 1889, and during the Republican period, we had 2 periods of dictatorship, military dictatorship. The first period was in 1937 until 1945, and the second period was between 1964 to 1985. Now we are under a democracy, but the military were democratically elected last year, but they still say that it's a democracy. Wow, and this is the slogan in Brazil in the 70s when we were under a military dictatorship. It says, Brazil, love it or leave it. It was the governmental slogan of the military regime. And last year, our new government recovered this slogan to say that this government support the dictatorship. So we are a young and fragile democracy, and this picture shows school teachers, fighting, demonstrating for better working conditions. And in Brazil, policemen love teachers. When teachers go to streets to demonstrate, they are very violent, really violent. So so I will talk about some challenges of social environmental protection in Brazil. So in 1972, the landmark of the Conference of Stockholm, the United Nations Conference on the Environment, took place in Stockholm. It was a very important meeting for environmental issues. And in Brazil, we were under a dictatorship, military dictatorship that went to Stockholm to say that Brazil was with open arms to receive polluters from all around the world because Brazil wanted development. So we were living under the economic miracle. Economic growth was about 10% per annum, but it was a development model that was against environmental protection. It was a development model based on mega projects for development. And some examples was hydroelectric power plants, mining industry, and here there is a picture of the impacts of mining industry. This region used to be a village where people used to live because, I don't know if you know, but in Brazil, one of the biggest social movement, the grassroots movement, is the landless workers movement. It's a big social movement because in Brazil there are a lot of people that doesn't have land, doesn't have place to live. So in our country, it's very common to destroy land to do mining industry, hydroelectric. This is before constructing hydroelectric power plant, before and after. Yes, this was in the 70s during the military dictatorship. So this was places where native people used to live, traditional communities used to live. So the impacts of the mega projects are very high, social and environmental impacts. So during the 70s, environmental education was restricted to science classroom. The issues was ecology, sanitation, protection of nature, kind of issues that didn't relate ecology with social issues. So depoliticized approach that did not interfere with the development agenda. So a very naive perspective of environmental education. But, and at this time, during the military dictatorship, the destruction of our Amazon forest was very huge, and murder of native people and conflicts for land and natural resources grew a lot because they destroyed the forest to agribusiness, to build big railroads, and to exploit mining. So this picture, the second picture, is Chico Mendes. He was a very important activist in Brazil. He is a symbol of environmental protection now in Brazil. He was a trade unionist and an environmental activist. He used to live in Amazon forest, and he organized workers to fight for the right to live in the forest. And he was killed in 1988. So during the 80s, the end of the military dictatorship started a transition to a civilian government, democratization process. And because of the impacts of the military dictatorship in the Amazon region, in the environment, there was a growth of rural social movements questioning the environmentalism and the environmental education based on conservation. So a lot of people and social movements started questioning that which kind of environmental education is that permit the destruction of nature. It's not possible. So the emergency of social environmentalist approach that link social and environment concerns. So these social movements, they influenced the process of building a new federal constitution in Brazil. So our federal constitution is from 1988. It is the constitution that we still have. And in the article 225, it states that all citizens have the right to an environment in ecological equilibrium as a public good for common use and essential to a healthy quality of life, thus mandating the public authorities and the people to defend it and preserve it to present and future generations. So it was a very progressive approach for a constitution, but it was the result of struggle, result of many murders, the result of many struggles from the social movements during the military dictatorships. So as the federal constitution says that the environment is a public good for common use, the Constitution also states that to uphold this right, it's incumbent upon the state to promote environmental education in all levels of schooling. So environmental education is a right, a constitutional right, because if the environment is a right, and defend the environment is it's a mission of the state and the people. So we need environmental education to defend the environment. So to guarantee the equal right to an environment in ecological equilibrium, which is essential to the health quality of life, we need environmental education. So environmental education is linked to the right to life, the right to be alive. So environmental education is also linked to democracy, to participatory democracy. So, and participatory democracy is formally promoted by the federal constitution, and it is rooted in the principle that citizen is a foundation of the democratic state, the social duties on collective issues. So, for example, environment is a social issue, and people have the right to an ecological, environment in equilibrium. Other issue is the exercise of popular sovereignty and participatory democracy as a form of public management. So it's the root of participatory democracy in Brazilian constitution. But although participation is recognized as a citizen's right, its implementation represents a great challenge if considering Brazilian anti-democratic history. So, environmental education, the institutionalization of environmental education after the Federal Constitution of 1988, the benchmark was in 1992. Brazil hosted the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development. It was the Rio Summit, the Rio 92. But the most important meetings was in parallel forums, the global forums, the non-official meeting. And during the non-official meetings, lots of activists, environmental educators, and scholars, they got together and discussed a program for environmental education in Brazil. So that they wrote a treaty of environmental education for sustainable society. And this treaty is a reference document for our national policies. And this treaty states that the participation of communities directly and indirectly affected by environmental issues in all instances is in the decision-making process regarding policies that shape environmental education initiatives. So participatory democracy was something that people were demanding from the government. And in 1999, our national environmental education policy was enacted, was a law. And this law states as purpose the incentive to permanent and responsible individual and collective participation in the preservation of the environmental balance, understanding the defense of environmental quality as an inseparable value of the exercise of citizenship. So it states that environmental education as an essential and permanent component of national education at all levels and modalities, also in formal and non-formal education. So this law, the National Environmental Education Policy, the structure of governance is the Ministry of the Environment and the Ministry of Education. In each one of these ministries, it was created a division for environmental education. So there was a division inside the Ministry of the Environment, another one inside the Ministry of Education. And these two divisions worked together with advisory committee composed of civil society organizations. I had to say that the new government destroyed this structure, the head of environmental education. Now I'm going back here. So, and the policy says that it's incumbent upon the educational institutions to promote environmental education in an interdisciplinary way. So, environmental education don't have to be in the curriculum as a specific curriculum discipline. It must be interdisciplinary in the curriculum. And also, the organs of the national environmental system, they have to promote environmental education actions on environmental conservation programs. And the mass media must permanently collaborate to disseminate educational information and practice. And public and private institutions, they have to promote workers' training programs to improve and control the work environment. Also, training programs about environmental impacts of the productive process. So, between 2003 and 2014, there was lots of environmental education policies at the federal level. I will talk about only until 2014, because after that, the government changed and a lot of things changed, and the programs, as the new government ended the divisions of environmental education in the ministries, the programs stopped. So we don't know how it will be in the future. So in this period, the federal government promoted lots of policies, lots of programs, and they promoted the creation of collectives of environmental educators, collectives of youth on environment, Agenda 21 local forums, environment committees at schools, environmental educators networks, environmental film festivals. Also, environmental education was inserted in different areas of public policies. For example, environmental education in the national system of water resources management, the program of environmental education, social mobilization in sanitation, program of environmental education and family agriculture, program of environmental education, social communication strategy and solid waste management, and the fund. The fund is the biggest problem in Brazil because we have no fund. Our national fund is the National Environment Fund, but the major programs are developed by funding of the United Nations Development Program and the international fundings. So environmental education in federal policies also was rooted in the goal of promoting participatory democracy. For example, one of the biggest programs, biggest actions was promoting conferences. National Conference on Environment, we call that, it was the adult conference because the government also promoted the youth conference on the environment. And the conference was spaces where civil society got together to discuss and to collaborate, developing, implementing the policies about environment and environmental education. And for example, the national conference are usually preceded by state conference. So each state promotes its conference, and the state elects a representative to go to the national level conference. And the youth conference is very interesting. The Ministry of Education encouraged the state education secretaries of the states to promote within public schools conferences within public schools. So each public schools promote its conference to discuss problems, environmental problems and issues, and each school develop a project, and the state committee elects some projects, and this project got together to the state youth conference. And during the state youth conference, some youth are elected to participate in the national conference. And the slogan of the youth conference is "Youth teaches youth." So it's a conference for youth to discuss between youth. So other space, very important space for environmental education and public policies in Brazil is in the process of licensing of industrial activities. The organ that give the permission for industrial activities in Brazil is called IBAMA, the Brazilian Institute for the Environment and Renewable Natural Resources. It's an organ linked to the Ministry of the Environment. And some educators that was public servants in this institute, they develop a methodology for working with environmental education during the process of licensing industrial activities. And the name of this approach of environmental education is Public Environmental Management Education. It's environmental education, but specifically for the process of licensing industrial activities, and it has a very specific methodology and framework. And this framework is instituted in a law that was enacted in 2012. So in Brazil, industrial activities must meet certain conditions to obtain and renew the operating license. So to guarantee the rights to the environment and the right to life, the social participation is very important during the licensing process. And so the framework of the public environmental management education is very direct because it put guidelines for the environmental education projects that must be developed with affected communities as part of the environmental licensing process. For example, if I own a petroleum company and I want to exploit petroleum in Brazil, I must have a license, environmental license. And to have this license, I must develop environmental education project, but not environmental education project that I want, but the project that is according to the law. And the law states that the project must be based on participative social environmental diagnosis to identify social environmental problems and conflicts related to the impacts of the industrial activity. And it must be developed with the social groups affected by industrial activity. So I must develop, if I own a petroleum company, I must develop an environmental project with the people that are being affected by the petroleum company. And the project must talk about the impacts of petroleum in their lives. I cannot talk about other environmental issues. I have to talk about the impacts of the petroleum company in their community lives. So it's very different. The purpose is to develop knowledge and skills among the most vulnerable social groups so that they are able to perceive the explicit and implicit risks and damages resulting from the venture in their daily lives, and qualifying them to intervene during the various steps of the licensing process. So this framework was very important, is still very important in licensing process in Brazil, because it's allow some vulnerable communities as fishermen, traditional fishermen, rural workers, and all the other traditional communities to get in touch with their rights, because through these environmental projects, they started to know their rights, the constitutional rights that states that environment is a common and public good. So it's a very important space for environmental education in Brazil. This framework influenced the projects that we developed in Rio de Janeiro state during the periods between 2007 and 2013. So in the state level, Rio de Janeiro is there, southeastern Brazil. It's a state with 92 municipalities, a population of 16 million people, and the structure for environmental education in the state. We have the government of the state of Rio de Janeiro, and as part of the government, the Secretary of the Environment and the Superintendence of Environmental Education is part of the Secretary of the Environment. So this superintendence, during this period, between 2007 and 2013, developed lots of environmental education projects influenced by the framework of that specific environmental education, the licensing process. And the funding came from the Environmental Conservancy and Urban Development Fund. It was a public fund composed by environmental fines, oil and gas royalties. So it was a lot of money, but only 1 to 5% of this public fund went to environmental education in this period. Some projects of the superintendents, the mission of the superintendents was very clear because as we used the framework of education licensing process that has a clear framework. So our mission was social transformation because environment is not disconnected from society. So cultural change is linked to social change, and we must talk about human-nature relations, but also talk about human-human relations. And both relations are rooted in exploitation. So human-human relation, we must talk about social classes, we must talk about exploitation, labor exploitation, slavery, conflicts, injustice, inequality, prejudice. And when we talk about human-nature relations, we talk about degradation in urban and rural environments. So lots of problems of water pollution, soil pollution, atmospheric pollution, the use of resources, natural resources also is an issue. So everything is connected. We cannot disconnect society from nature. The conceptual foundations of our work was influenced by a Brazilian educator called Paulo, 10 minutes? I can't see. 1 minute? Oh my God. So I will run. I want to okay. So I will show you some projects. One project was a program called Links of Diversity that is based in the statement that biological and cultural diversity are connected and they both are under threat. So this program worked with mediating conflicts, African religions practice inside protected areas. So it talks about environmental racism. The other program talks about homophobia, tackling homophobia with under the motto of health environment is an environment without homophobia. Other program was in schools, and special program that I wanted to talk about is the Link of Citizenship program. It was a program developed in schools, and the methodology of the program was very interesting. The study about critical environmental education, public environmental management education the study on the territory where the school is in, so the reality that students live, and political mobilization. So I have some pictures of workshops about critical environmental education to elementary school students and teachers. Theoretically, it was very important to understand the difference between environmental problem and environmental conflict. And so the study on the territory was based on the participatory social environmental diagnosis and social environmental mapping and identifying problems and conflicts. So students used interviews, photographic records, did social environmental mapping to map where is environmental problems and where are conflicts, in social environmental conflicts. What is a social environmental conflict? Is when one social group is fighting for their rights to the environment. So a conflict says that groups are being affected and they are mobilized to fight for their rights. And they did environmental history and timeline to study the history of the environmental problems and conflicts. And political mobilization was developed according to the needs to identify the needs identified during the work. So the students and the teacher, they, for example, wrote a manifesto of the importance of public schools in the environmental management. So the structure of implementation, the inputs and outputs, and the challenges of implementing critical environmental education policies, lots of challenges. For the first challenges is the neoliberal governance of public policies, the privatization of public sphere, insufficient funding for schools, undemocratic school management, low wages and poor working conditions for teachers, violence in some school neighborhoods, and when the government changes, the programs are interrupted. So authoritarian governments usually promote more conservative environmental education perspective, disconnecting social and environmental issues. So this year, in 2019, we have lots of challenges in Brazil for environmental education and participation, and lots of actions that our new president took. The end of structure for environmental education in the ministry, the end of structure of participatory democracy, the weakening of Brazil's leadership in the climate change agenda, extinction of policies that provided support for traditional communities, lots of step backs. The weakening of water resources protection, weakening of the roles for environmental licenses. So our new government is putting lots of challenges for us educators. And so an institutionalization of environmental education policies at national and state level in Brazil were marked by efforts of fostering participatory democracy and mobilization around environmental issues. But the current political scenario points to increasing confrontation over the access and use of environmental resources. So growing number of murdered environmental activists and human rights defenders points that it's even more important to link environmental education to the defense of the right to life. So I must finish, but I have lots of information, and my contact is here, and I will be very happy to get in touch with you and to continue this conversation. Thank you.
네, 감사합니다. 많은 얘기를 해주신